So on to today's session. First of all, we've got Danielle Salisbury, Head of Communications at South Yorkshire Combined Authority.
Here we go. So morning, everyone. Thank you for having me speak on the webinar today. It's really exciting to be able to share what we did in our bus franchising consultation with everyone. So I thought I would kick off with this picture. So this is me, and this was me speaking to a Rotherham resident as part of our consultation campaign, which is an act that actually saw me win a bit of a jokey team award of MVE, or Most Valuable Ear, because I actually spoke to this resident for about 2 hours. Which was very full on, but nothing that a Yorkshire tea couldn't fix. And it was actually a really insightful learning for me, because when we think of sort of engagement and consultations, we think of response numbers or click-through rates, but actually what we learned from this campaign is it's also about the listening and the deep human listening that we as sort of combined authorities, local government organisations need to do in order to help our residents feel as though they're part of what we're working on. And that is a kind of key theme that weave throughout this consultation. And so I'm happy to take you through what we did. So we consulted on taking back control of our buses through bus franchising in October last year. The consultation was 12 weeks, and as I'm sure you're all well versed in, there were many statutory requirements that we had to take into consideration as well. So we set up a working group with representatives from our legal team, from our data team, and we also met regularly with our research agency who were conducting the consultation, who were DJS Research, who had done Manchester and West Yorkshire's consultations before. So the first task with that working group was to set some campaign objectives. And as you can see, our kind of key themes were around not just informing and maximum participation, but it was also around creating easy to understand content and making sure that the consultation process was accessible and was inclusive. And so a lot of what we did was around creating documents that were accessible or easy to read documents, or making sure, I've got one of our huge consultation documents here, making sure these were as visible as possible. So we put them inside every library in South Yorkshire, every interchange, in our offices, in council offices. And so we just wanted to make sure that everyone in South Yorkshire was kind of had a touch point at some point throughout the 12-week consultation period. And it was these objectives that sort of underpinned everything that we did. So we were quite ambitious with this campaign, as we already knew from years of campaigning about buses in South Yorkshire that we had a population that were incensed about this topic. So we wanted to capitalise on that and use these voices to bolster our campaign and get high response numbers. And we didn't just want high response numbers because, you know, it's something positive to talk about and shout about, but also because it shows the likes of government, bus operators, and our communities actually what matters most, and it helps us as an MCA to sort of drive policy change from there, and of course funding for buses if we go into the bus franchising. So we advertised as many places as we could. As you can see, we did it in local print media, on radio, outdoor, on bus, and on our digital platforms. We saw this as a real investment. And we wanted to maximise campaign visibility across multiple channels and make sure that, like I said, there are multiple touch points that people in South Yorkshire could get. We also dropped leaflets into 100,000 households in the region. We were aiming to do every household in the region, but it was just too expensive. So we decided to do 100,000, and we just sort of made sure that the postcode data that we used, again, aligned with our campaign objectives. We had an extensive media campaign. We did video explainers and animations, long form and short form, to make it as easy to understand as possible. And then we had quite a large and extensive engagement program as well. We also committed to constantly monitoring the response statistics that we used to get through from the research agency every week. So this was just in case we needed to intervene at any point to make sure that we were aligned with those campaign objectives. And so off the back of this, we did actually begin to tweak our campaign as we went along. So we increased the number of engagement events and the types of venues that we were going to. We reassigned our budget and our efforts on Google and on Meta ads, which I'll come on to in a bit. We created PR milestones throughout. So we either sort of plotted those in by looking at sort of halfway points or 2 weeks to go, but we also looked at, when our responses were, some of the population were underrepresented in our responses, we would sort of create PR opportunities around that. And then we also consistently responded to people's requirements, which I know sounds like an obvious one, but it genuinely did have an impact. So this looked like us sending out marketing and events packs. So, we couldn't do every single event that we were asked to do, but we encouraged, for example, parish councils to hold their own events if they felt like their community needed one. We sent out paper surveys to anyone that requested them. And so we were just constantly responding like that. So as I've mentioned, driving visibility and creating multiple campaign touch points was important to us. We wanted to be everywhere so that everyone had a fair chance at responding to the consultation. And we also, I don't know if I mentioned it on the first slide actually, but we also translated our documents into our 4 most non-English speaking languages in South Yorkshire. And so we wanted to make it as fair a process as possible, and this sort of drove us to do quite an extensive advertising campaign. We also had to make sure our information was clear, concise, and in a language that not only informed but encouraged people to take part. And hopefully this is going to work. So if someone could give me a thumbs up, but this is a radio advert that we used. I think we advertised for 4 weeks during the campaign period.
Buses keep our towns and cities moving and our countryside accessible, but some people don't think the services are working. So South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority want to take it back under public control to fix it. A public consultation is now open, and the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority want to hear if you agree with the proposals to own the depots and bus fleet and be responsible for fares, routes and improvements. Your voice matters. Search Bus Reform South Yorkshire. Buses keep our towns and cities.
We don't want to replay. So our drop-in sessions that we hosted 30 of them in South Yorkshire, and then DJS Research also conducted 5 focus groups. Our drop-in sessions were really valuable opportunities to inform our communities, engage with our communities, and also actually provide some one-to-one assistance with some of those residents that, perhaps couldn't use a computer. We helped someone with sight difficulties to fill in the paper survey. My colleague actually wrote verbatim what he wanted to say down onto a paper survey. And so we were able to give that one-to-one assistance if people needed it, which I think was really valuable, and obviously kind of ensured we weren't leaving anyone out and just relying on the digital version of the survey. But then we also, off the back of kind of spotting that young people weren't engaging in the consultation early on in the 12-week period, we decided to expand our engagement programme, and we went to every college and university in South Yorkshire, which again was really effective and was actually a lot of fun because we were able to sort of tailor what we did. What we got up to at Penistone Library was very different to what we got up to in Sheffield College and Barnsley College, and we had a really valuable session at Sheffield Hallam University actually, where we had a rollout of paper that had sort of questions and prompts throughout, and the students were coming over and writing down their responses to that, and then were sort of encouraged to take part in the consultation as well, and sort of spoken to about how it could affect them moving forward. And this events and engagement programme, as you can see, resulted in 285 responses to the consultation through paper surveys. So actually it was really valuable because it essentially enabled 285 separate individuals to take part in the consultation that may not have been able to take part otherwise. So Moving on to some of our campaign stats. As I mentioned, we intervened throughout the campaign to try to improve numbers from underrepresented communities, and this graph shows just how those interventions helped. So as I said, we spotted early on that young people weren't engaging, but we also saw that our ethnic minority communities were not represented in the same way that our population is represented. So we wanted to make sure that we were proactively reaching out to these communities. So we tweaked our digital campaign. We had a look at the postcodes that we were delivering the 100,000 household leaflets to, and we were able to have some quite good results from it, as you can see. So 5% of the respondents were young people and 3% of the respondents were ethnic minority groups at the beginning of the campaign, but this increased to 13% of young people and 6% of ethnic minority groups. And our partner agency, DJS Research, confirmed that it is the highest response rate from young people that they've seen in a bus franchising consultation exercise. So we were really proud of that, because obviously young people are the ones that are going to be sort of long-term influenced by this policy. So this slide exemplifies a couple of things for me. First of all, how impactful some of the PR pushes were, but second of all, how we never gave up and how we constantly put out new materials and assets. So these are the peaks throughout the campaign on our webpage. So you will see that where we saw peaks, occasionally it was because of our PR and media efforts, but it was also because I think we just never kind of gave up with our campaign creative. We constantly refreshed our content, which meant we weren't overusing it. And we also did a last chance push right at the end, which if you go back to the last slide, if you see those kind of 4 peaks at the end, it did impact our response numbers. These just kept going and going right to the very end. Our social media posts throughout the campaign gained an average of just over 1% engagement. And this improved week on week, and 1% sounds low, doesn't it? But actually, it goes against the grain of the stuff that we're usually putting out on our social media. So usually with all of our sustained campaigns, engagement goes down over time as our assets get fatigued. But this, with mixing up our messaging and our visuals, it was able to hold people's attention and actively improve engagement. And so the final stat for you now is probably my favourite one, because you've probably all taken part in a campaign before that feels like you're screaming into the void with no idea if it's landing. And this is why I love this stat, because our top web referrals were direct, which means we don't really know how they got to us. It could have been that radio ad you just heard, it could have been word of mouth, but the important thing is that they did reach us and that they were then directed to the campaign information, and some of them will have responded to the survey off the back of that. And I think it's just a clear indication of how multi-channel marketing can really sort of bring success. So how did we do with our consultation? So our bus franchising consultation closed with the highest response rate per capita at the time. So we had our northern neighbours to compare ourselves to, and our response percentage exceeded them all. But not only that, the consultation went on to drive change, because in March, just gone, at our MCA board, based on the consultation process, our mayor announced that we would create a bus franchising scheme in South Yorkshire. And as you can see, we celebrated with a very giant cookie. And this is a picture of the mayor on our bus franchising decision day with some of our local leaders as well. So campaign learnings. So we saw that campaign visibility is key, that a multi-channel campaign really worked in terms of getting the campaign visible and the direct referrals that we achieved, which you've just seen on that slide. Also, that our accessibility initiatives, such as our translated documents, our easy read booklets and our paper surveys, all ensured that everyone could participate. Quality over quantity. So this one is in there because not all of our engagement events saw high numbers. There were some that only a handful of people turned up to, but I guess the point was for us, it was still valuable if we came away from it with having assisted someone to take part in the consultation. The work starts before the consultation. So for us in South Yorkshire, buses is something that people are very sort of passionate about. And we've been campaigning about this for years. We've campaigned for a fairer bus deal for people in South Yorkshire over previous years. And I think the response numbers for the consultation early on just showed how much that had landed with people in the region, and how much they already sort of knew about this because of all the comms and marketing we'd done prior to even beginning to think about the consultation. And the final learning is, if in doubt, stick a dog on your campaign. And I know you're probably thinking, what are you on about? That is because shortly after our bus consultation, we also launched a consultation to see if residents would like to see dogs back on trams in the region. And embarrassingly for the bus franchising consultation, we got over 10,000 responses for this, which absolutely smashes out the park our bus franchising consultation. But in all seriousness, I think this consultation was a pleasure to work on because it drove some serious policy change in South Yorkshire on something, like I said, that our residents have been passionate about for years. And our team, you know, we were going out to 30 events across the region, and our team got to speak to some of these people face to face and really see how the work that they do, which comes in marketing, sometimes it doesn't feel that important as work that other colleagues of the departments might be working on, but we really got to see how important it can be, and that it's not always just about the telling in comms and marketing. We're always telling people, but it's also about the listening as well. And that's it. I've reached the end of the presentation, so I hope that was useful.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Yeah, that really, really excellent content there, and yeah, as well as the learning from our canine friends, which I'm sure Ed will know about in terms of dogs at polling stations, but also I think there's definitely some real pride in that campaign that comes through, Danielle. It's always nice to know that the results have come through, particularly when comparing against your northern counterparts. But yeah, we'll move straight on to a more southern case study from Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and while Ed is just uploading his slides to talk about a very similar bus consultation, just wanted to introduce him. This is Ed Coleman, Head of Communications and Engagement and Public Affairs for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority. Really pleased and thankful for Ed joining us today, because he is even busier than usual getting to grips with a new mayor in his area since the recent election. So over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Andrew. So I will try not to duplicate any of what Danielle's just said, actually, but I think there is probably a huge amount of synergy between the two consultations, and actually that point around the importance of buses in mayoral combined authorities, where you've got that split between rural and urban populations, is something that's come through loud and clear through the process. So in terms of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, we also went out for consultation last year, and before the mayoral election, the previous mayor took a decision to implement a franchising scheme back in February this year. So that's where we are in the journey. So we're now looking at what does that mean under a new political administration, and just reviewing some elements of that scheme following the elections, but are still pressing ahead with a review of the proposed scheme. So in terms of the consultation itself, very similar, really. We implemented an approach based around the 5 cases in the business model. So the strategic case, the economic case, the commercial case, the financial case, and the management case, in terms of what it was we were proposing. So for us, we were really focused on trying to make sure that people had enough information to give us an informed response, and they understood the sort of range of issues around franchising. So not just making this a sort of binary referendum on the proposed franchising scheme, but also one of the challenges is that we know everyone has something to say around buses, but actually channeling that in a way that was constructive and able to add value not only to this consultation, but to others. shut the door, some background noise there. We complemented the consultation and the engagement with some qualitative research as well. So we targeted specific user groups that we knew would be harder to engage through a traditional consultation. And you can see those set out there. I don't propose on going through them in huge detail, but there was an absolute focus on making sure the consultation was as representative as possible and thinking about those groups, those hard to reach audiences, those demographics facing one or multiple barriers in terms of traditional engagement, and making sure that they were at the forefront of our thinking as we went through the planning for the consultation. In terms of the consultation process, clearly we wanted to raise awareness of the consultation, but also the reasons why the combined authority were consulting on this proposed franchising scheme. So this was building on work we'd done previously, where we had quite a good starting point in terms of we previously consulted on the introduction of a mayoral precept, which was introduced at £12 a year for a Band D property and is now £36 a year for a Band D property, to specifically subsidise routes in largely rural areas that were not commercially viable, but were providing sort of vital connectivity to some of those areas around access to employment, access to leisure and access to healthcare. So we had a really good insight base in terms of what we knew people already thought around buses in the region and some of the challenges that people were seeing in terms of the reliability, the punctuality, the affordability, and just the connectivity of services, the sort of integration of services arriving that didn't allow for people to catch connecting trains or connecting services as well. So we wanted to try and utilise that work we'd already done in the consultation as well, which was almost the sort of case for change that's prevalent through the business case, that ultimately the do nothing option, the managed decline option, was not an option because it would have meant less services and further decline and further risk of isolation and reduced connectivity. Clearly, that understanding of the proposed franchising scheme is really difficult, and in terms of thinking about the gunning principles and how they translate into the consultation and satisfying those statutory obligations that Danielle mentioned earlier on, we put a lot of effort into trying to simplify the proposed franchising scheme as much as possible, thinking about how it relates to an enhanced partnership, which were the two options ultimately, and making sure that there was that flexibility built in throughout the campaign so that we could pivot, we could amend our approach at those relevant milestones and adapt as we needed to go through. Other key point, I think, absolutely making sure that we'd taken those top four census languages in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and made sure that the material was available for those outside of English, and then making that point that this wasn't just a consultation for those current bus users. Bus users are an incredibly important part of the demographic, but also those who could benefit from the bus in future, thinking about our wider responsibilities and how we might look to encourage behaviour change and the knock-on impact in terms of congestion, which we know is particularly an issue in Cambridge. In terms of the process, which is probably what I'm going to talk a little bit more about in terms of getting from the end of the consultation to a report. Clearly, this was additional to our core, staffing capability within the organisation. So we brought in a really good coalition of organisations through Westco Communications, which I'm sure is an organisation that colleagues will be familiar with. JP and the team at CAN were part of that as well, as were Walnut Unlimited on the research and the code frame as well. And they worked very closely with the technical consultants that our colleagues in passenger transport had appointed to do some of the more statutory elements around the response to consultation and what did it mean for each of those themes within the business case. At the heart of all of that was a really robust and rigorous consultation log, so making sure that we were absolutely checking, logging, and had that full audit trail in the event of any challenge or possible judicial review to the process, which we know there was precedent for elsewhere in the country for operators. So being alive to that as we were going through the consultation, but always trying to balance that with being as approachable and as engaging as possible, which was a tightrope we were consistently trying to walk throughout the consultation. That long and short questionnaire structure enabled us to pull something together which could be evaluated against the 5 case model and provided specific feedback against the 5 cases. So we could demonstrate at the end of it, this was feedback received both from statutory consultees and non-statutory consultees against the 5 cases, as well as that sort of overall opinion around the implementation of a franchising scheme versus the implementation of an enhanced partnership. We're very happy to share the sort of full consultation report, which sets out this methodology in a lot more detail. But ultimately, the process of analysing the content of those surveys was based on a really complicated thematic coding process, which saw both the technical consultants and our engagement team and research team working together to pull that code framework together, the code frame together. We developed that initial code frame based on some of that early insight spoken about, some of the results that had come through from other consultations on bus franchising or bus reform elsewhere in the country, the survey questions that we were proposing, and then we pivoted it based on the first 500 responses that we received and continue to do that as we went through. Under the strategic case, so one of those 5 cases, we ended up with 12 different themes from the code frame, which allowed us to really look at that. You said, we've listened, we've actioned, we've reflected feedback and made sure that the business case and the proposed franchising scheme is fit for purpose for the residents and businesses of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And that flexibility throughout the consultation process to dynamically evolve the code frame, where we started to get some more diverse responses that maybe didn't follow the initial themes that we saw coming through. That all came together into 11 chapters that made up the consultation report. As you can see there on the screen, I'm not going to go through each of the chapters in detail, but ultimately this was about making sure that the elected mayor was able to really take an informed decision and show that he had considered the feedback from the consultation, and that this was a consultation that absolutely served a purpose in terms of raising awareness and demonstrating the need for change, but also absolutely enabled the elected mayor to show that he'd considered feedback, had pivoted where necessary based on the feedback from the consultation, and was able to show that he was making a robust, informed decision based on a comprehensive evidence base and statutory consultation. Our numbers are not probably not comparable with some of the others. We benchmarked ours against West Yorkshire, and we set ourselves an initial target of about 1,200 responses. So we're pleased with the 1,600 that we had back for us as an authority, as a smaller combined authority. This was sort of our first significant piece of public consultation in this way, certainly since I joined the organisation a couple of years ago, and has sort of established a new benchmark for us in terms of our approach to public consultation and statutory consultations. Overall, in terms of the support and the pros for the franchising scheme, this was the headline that then led to that decision being taken earlier this year around the proposed franchising scheme. What's not covered in the slides that I think is probably really important to mention at this stage is the idea around ongoing engagement through the mobilisation. So the period from a decision to implement a franchising scheme to first services operating under a franchise model for us is going to be somewhere in the region of about 2.5 years. And during that time, what's really clear is that that insight, those resident groups, that engagement that we built up during the consultation, they want to work with us to shape what a franchise network looks like and what the franchise scheme looks like in reality across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And ultimately, that's only a good thing for us. I think sometimes for us as a combined authority in quite a complex local government landscape where we've still got 2 tiers below us currently, it's quite hard sometimes to know how to engage or what level to engage at. Our constituent authorities were really supportive of the process and really helped us with some of that more community-based engagement that the combined authority possibly hasn't done as much of previously. But that real commitment to working with us going forward and ensuring that this isn't a consultation that's just served a binary purpose in terms of enabling a decision. Actually, that insight, that willingness to provide views and opinions is something we can take forward, and we're thinking currently about how we maintain sort of resident panels and some of those community groups into the mobilisation stage and beyond in terms of the design of the network and also the promotion of franchised services as well. So for us, it's been a really beneficial exercise, both in terms of establishing a new benchmark for statutory consultation following a sort of period of change and transformation within the team, but also about showing the opportunities going forward and giving us an opportunity to put engagement and ongoing engagement at the heart of that mobilisation plan, and probably quite helpful in terms of opening colleagues' eyes to the important role of ongoing engagement in that process as well. Yes, there's clearly a procurement exercise, there's clearly a mobilisation exercise, and there's a lot of legal work to be done, but actually how we communicate it and how people feel part of that journey is just as important, I think, is one of the key takeaways for us. So I think I'm slightly over time, Andrew, but I'll pass back to you at that point.
Thanks, Ed. Really insightful presentation. I think I liked the fact that there were definitely some synergies with Danielle's presentation, but equally, you've gone into a lot of depth there in some of the different areas, and certainly the thing that came through was that you really demonstrated the complexity of that consultation, and particularly around some of the coding and those key themes, and certainly in my time in Cambridge County Council, it was really really good, and I think I would also endorse that kind of partnership approach, and I think that was really useful. I'm going to move us straight on to our last but not least presenter, and then I will very much want to encourage comments and questions from the floor, as well as potentially the speakers making any other comments that you want in terms of the other presentations that you've heard today. So thanks, JP, for pulling up your slides. I'm sure many of you already know John Paul Dunnan, who is CAN's Collaboration Director, and he's going to be focusing on a bit broader public transport and really focusing in on the most effective channels to use. So take it away, JP. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Danielle and Ed, for those presentations. There will be things that are duplicates of what you've said. I think we'll come to some agreement on many of the things that works, but I will just quickly cover some of the sort of principles beneath how you go about amplifying consultations, common challenges, what we've learned from running lots of different campaigns to amplify such a whole array of consultations, and some proposed super and maybe future tactics as we do more and more consultation and do it in a way that suits those audiences. Just a quick update. It can help lots of public sector organisations run campaigns and to evaluate them and to optimise them. We've run over 3,000, including 200 plus consultations, yes, in transport, but also around landlord licensing schemes, local plans and so on. And our job in all of those is to ensure that we reach everyone and that everyone has opportunity to interact, and that we also help the consultations become more and more representative as they run. And we underlying that some sort of key local government communication principles. Everything we do must be inclusive. And that's about telling really simple stories so that people can understand. And I think that's where communications people really add a lot of value to these sorts of activities. You need not just to focus on digital, but to have that human and that physical element. And we must obviously reach at least 90+% of all target audiences. And that is something which I think there's often a question mark on. And it's really important, particularly in consultations, to be able to prove that you've done that. We believe that comms as a profession is accelerating savings all the time for their organizations, and that's about demonstrating impact. It's also about using the comms estate to accelerate accelerate engagement and make savings, and potentially as well, comms people are brilliant at connecting campaigns, seeing where those overlaps are and making those connections. So we can always demonstrate value worth our weight, maybe not even in gold, but platinum and maybe diamonds by the amount that we can save our organizations. And underpinning both both of those two is this absolute non-compromisable need for data to demonstrate reach, to look at response, and to optimize over time, to demonstrate impact. And that's something that's becoming easier and easier as technology gets better. I think when you embark on amplifying a consultation, you've got some challenges, and these challenges aren't getting smaller. So media consumption is less and less centralized. There's more fragmentation, particularly by specific audiences. There's a huge challenge around the complexity of some of the things we're trying to talk about and simplifying them. There's also a huge challenge around the sorts of user experiences that we give people in order to interact, which is linked to the complexity, but also to the number of questions and things that we need to ask. And there's always a problem with getting representation from audiences that, through either scarce resources or lack of trust, are less inclined to interact with us. And what we've learned over time is, obviously a multi-channel approach is essential, but which channels work best? The use of video explainers, making user experience and landing pages really, really inclusive, and maybe as well having various levels of priority of questions so that you can achieve much more scale. But I'll explain some of that in a little bit more detail. Focusing on Ed's campaign, it was really useful throughout the campaign to be able to correlate not just campaign interactions and measured interactions, but also the impact of those interactions on response rates. So to measure submissions by date and then to look at various activities and understand what drove responses. We can see little spikes in there. I believe there was the South Cambridgeshire agnostic uprising where I think about 23 people got together to say that they neither opposed nor approved of the proposals, but were able to see in real time the physical events, which digital media, which off above the line media was driving response. And the campaign was designed so that it was segmented and had tracking so we could see what was driving interaction. QR codes on letters, on targeted leaflets, on posters in certain buildings. And what we really saw was that it was the direct mail and targeted posters in certain locations that really drove it. We got very poor response from some of the more unmeasurable above the line activities like radio and digital 6-sheets in supermarkets and so on. So much so that we could then look at the cost per land. It was about £81 for above the line activities, so out of home, things like that, and about 29 pence for paid digital. That's not abnormal, but it is quite a big gap, 277 times increase in cost. The top performing tactic throughout was remarketing to the buses information pages in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and to certain pages on the council estate like school term dates and things like that. So we're able to build audience in places where we knew people were who might have an opinion and bring that audience through. And the school term dates page was brilliant for getting responses from parents because that was an underrepresented group. So two super tactics there. I think there's sometimes a perception that we have to do certain things with consultations. We have to buy or invest in a lot of paid channels that we kind of know deep down don't really work, and do a relatively small investment in things that we know do work. I think it's worth checking policies and making sure you understand what is actually prescribed. And that means that you can probably do stuff that you know doesn't work, but you kind of have to do for visibility, but invest in it much less, leaving you more budget to do the stuff that does work, which means more response, more representation, more outcome. In our experience of using paid digital channels, some of the things that are talked about, because of targeting capabilities or lack of targeting capabilities, reach, cost per click, and the availability of alternatives, we don't recommend using for paid, TikTok, X, Nextdoor, or LinkedIn. The relative reach, the relative interactions, and the targeting capabilities mean they don't work particularly well. We also suggest, deprioritizing as much as possible, paying for some of these channels and suppliers. Not that we're against them in principle, but just because of that very low cost per interaction, and also they can't really prove the audiences that they get to in terms of frequency and so on. And you can achieve that reach much better in other ways. For example, by using your own estate. So using Sheffield's website advertising, or putting ads in emails, or using your own out-of-home estate means that you get free amplification, you get that visibility, you get a lot of reach, and it doesn't actually cost you anything. You can also build audiences here, as we showed with Peterborough. Often the reason for investing a lot of above the line stuff is to reach people who maybe are digitally disadvantaged, grudgingly digital, as you could put it, or they are actually in digitally divided households. And that's where direct mail really works. With direct mail as well, you can map your digitally divided households and really target direct mail in order to reduce costs. Having a map of digitally divided or digitally disadvantaged households is a really useful way for covering that gap without using less effective media, and making sure that you give people a route to engage. Obviously make sure then, if you're targeting digitally divided households, that you're not then putting a QR code on or a website. It's probably best to tell them, to phone number or highlight events in order to target people. So that's a neat way of being efficient. So the kind of optimal amplification mix, you've got your owned channels, the direct mail to digitally divided households, the entire Google infrastructure, search, YouTube, the display network, Meta, as both previous presentations have mentioned, but essentially Snapchat for younger audiences. Snapchat is if you want to get representation from young people, and young people have very positive opinions about bus transport, and they also are more than happy to engage on that platform. It's really key to have them, not just for consultations, but also then for nudging uptake and socially norming use of buses going forward. A very common problem is way too much information on landing pages, which then become a bit of a cognitive challenge for people to work through. Also, another problem is collecting maybe more information than you need. This is an example from an ICB in West Yorkshire. We had non-mandatory ethnicity collection before that date, that February the 27th, and we were then asked to make it mandatory. And what we found was that then the cost per response went up significantly. So it's one to think about, do you need to capture ethnicity mandatory, or can you just leave it optional and use a representative sample? What we actually saw as well, and this is really worth bearing in mind, is that the cost per response post making it mandatory went up most for the media we were using to target specific communities and ethnicities, which is concerning. It also went up most for young people. So the mandatory collection of it actually creates an inequality in consumption, and that is something really worth thinking about. This was around a slightly more contentious issue around vaccination, but be careful about understanding, do I need this? And there might be a negative perception, a negative impact on performance if I do collect that subject. And these are some of the things that were, it's just worth noting, collecting it doesn't necessarily, it's not a purely positive experience for everyone. Lots of people giving errant information, demonstrating anger, and preferring not to say. So it's one worth considering. I think also in the field of user experience, it's well worth considering, particularly on social media, using in-platform forms. Social media doesn't like you clicking to and clicking away from their platforms. They want you to stay there. So consider building elements of the consultation, or even the whole thing, in Snapchat, in Meta, and potentially in LinkedIn and places like that. That can lead to like 5 times the response, and is a really powerful way of driving response in those platforms. And here we can see that the use of in-platform lead gen delivering a sort of 5 times improvement on a live campaign as we ran it. So just thinking about the sort of the marketing communications funnel, you've got your owned channels, direct mail, and awareness channels, social and Google, but then you've also got search and remarketing, really important for driving people that bounce back to surveys and getting them to complete, and then really accessible, simple user experience at the other end. That data then all needs to be fed together so that you can optimize. You can really see where the gaps are, where you need to refocus efforts, and so on. And with that setup, you can deliver, or it becomes much less painful to deliver consultation amplification. And so over the period of the campaign, we can optimize and drive towards the channels and activities that are working. So at the beginning of the campaign, you're at your least efficient, and at the end, you're at your most efficient. So some simple learnings that we've had, which are not a million miles away from what we've already heard, but simple and dynamic user experience, meaning you can put different questions in different places and bring different audiences into the consultation depending on where they are. It is essential that you get the plumbing right from the beginning. That's use of pixels in order to optimize and evaluate and to remarket to certain audiences that haven't completed. It's important when you design the campaign to phase it so you can see different things working at different times, which really helps with attribution and really helps with understanding what works with whom and when. Thoroughly recommend using your own transport sites and out of home, but then also augmenting, very importantly, with direct mail to prove you've reached everybody, and then obviously paid digital channels, including Snapchat. It's really important to be able to measure very, very quickly, have we reached near enough to 100% of the target audience or the residents in that area? Where are the gaps in response? And then towards the end, start to be able to target those audiences. And we recommend saving over 50% of your budget for that gap analysis, that gap targeting, and then the fear of missing out, i.e. last chance to have your say, and a small amount left over at the end to feed back, to say it's completed, this is what we've seen, this is what people said, and this is what we're going to do as a result. That feedback phase is really important so that people understand the efficacy of engaging with consultations, and probably keeps them open to engaging again in the future. And just some super and future tactics. We think that to get round that annoyance of collecting lots of data, personal data from people every time, building panels and then making those panels representative over time, with then having multiple opportunities, as Ed was alluding to engage these audiences and ask them questions, potentially considering rewarding them with systems like Better Points to shop with local businesses. But that could be a much more efficient way of engaging more consistently. Those panels can then be driven by your owned estate. So when people move to the area, you can remarket to council tax pages, encourage them to join the panel and so on. And so you replenish and build that voice. We're starting to experiment with in-app alerts, so integrating into platforms like Ringo, like Smoke Free, a whole range of apps that your council or your organisation, combined authority, might promote. For example, targeting drivers about proposed road works and road changes, really efficient way of driving response. Also, when you run campaigns, consider building audiences, remarketing audiences, which can then be used for behavior change campaigns or for collaboration with other campaigns. So young audiences, then potentially connecting them with skills opportunities around potentially new routes, new career pathways. I'm talking about bus routes and career pathways. These things overlapping are particularly in combined authorities' purview, but that the audience of every single consultation can be saved and used for future. And to reinforce Danielle's point, we have seen in many consultations the uses of pictures of animals cannot be underestimated. A frog in Enfield drove over 500 responses, talking about parks and green spaces. So weave them in. It doesn't have to be the only thing, but definitely use pictures of animals. People empathize with them, and it seems to bring out the best in people as well. So sorry, that was a very quick one through. Hopefully there's some useful information there, and please do speak to Matt or to me if you want any further information, any detail, any planned insight, or help with anything that you're doing.
Thanks, JP. I definitely think that the frog in Enfield has stolen the show in terms of your presentation, and like the pink elephant, I'm struggling to sort of think back to all of the impressive things that you talked about in terms of your digital campaigns. But more seriously, I'm going to open it up to some questions and comments there. But I definitely think there was some synergy across all of those very different presentations. But thank you for all of those. I think first of all, if it's okay, I'm going to bring in Danielle. I don't know if you had any specific learning or potentially things that you might have done differently based on either what you've heard today or even just building on some of the canine or frog comparisons. Over to you, Danielle.
It's really funny because I've actually brought my mug that has my dog on it as well, so I just feel like I'm promoting pictures of animals. No, I was just going to pick up on something that JP said in that presentation, actually, just around phasing the campaign. Obviously, I sort of spoke about that. A lot of ours was like accidentally phased, just based on capacity and resource. So obviously we knew that we would have sort of PR milestones, but things such as our easy read wasn't ready on launch day, but it wasn't like a big panic, like, oh God, so we can't launch. It was just, no, it's okay. We're going out with the main sort of consultation on launch day, and we'll follow up next week, or I think it was actually ready a couple of days after. And it just added to the content. And like I said, we were constantly refreshing. In a similar vein, our translations weren't ready on launch day, and our short form video and our animation wasn't ready, but it didn't matter because we were able to just plot it in. And if anything, we sort of realized, actually, I think the animation, I don't think we put out until December, just because we didn't want to sort of exhaust all our content at the start and then it get sort of fatigued really early on. In terms of learning, so one thing I forgot to mention actually is a couple of other communities that we were sort of pushing for, but in the end it didn't quite work for us, was two of our boroughs, Rotherham and Barnsley. We had, in terms of just sort of population numbers, it wasn't representative in terms of how many people were responding from those boroughs. And so I think that's not abnormal for our combined authority. We get a lot of response from obviously Sheffield, with that being our main city, but we've also seen an increase in how much Doncaster residents are engaged with us because of everything that we've had going on with Doncaster Airport as well. So it wasn't a surprise to us that Rotherham and Barnsley's numbers were lower than we had hoped, but I think it's obviously shown us as a combined authority, not just through this consultation period, but that we do need to reach out to those and really get ourselves into those communities and engage with them more. And on that note, we have just as part of the need for more consultations, a lot of the work that the Mayor is doing on engaging with residents in South Yorkshire, we are sort of building our engagement team at the moment. So we do have a Director of Strategic Partnerships who is building up a team of engagement officers. And so in the future, that engagement program that I spoke about in the presentation will probably actually have a lot more in depth, a lot more audience insight, and will be a lot more strategically placed. So yeah, I think there was a lot to learn, a lot of JP. I think there was a lot that sort of you were recommending that we'd done. We did look at Snapchat for the young people, but I think in the end, just going to the colleges and universities actually just really helped with that one. And through our skills campaigns and education schemes that we do have, we were able to reach out to our schools as well to get them to share the messages amongst their students and parents.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. And yeah, I think as you were talking, I think yeah, there's definitely some synergies with I think what Ed was talking about in terms of building those longer term kind of panels and you know whether it's yeah those slightly harder to reach areas or areas like Rotherham and Barnsley with lower engagement rates. Yeah, obviously how you can sort of pick that up and sort of build on that in the future. I think it's also great that Liam and other colleagues are looking at that in sort of the round, but also still looking at different ways in which you can use some of those channels for younger audience. I think the other thing that I picked up in terms of that building momentum, you know, the spikes that you saw based on the sort of the PR opportunity you were doing, but also what I think JP was sort of doing in terms of suggesting how you can save some of that campaign budget either halfway through or towards the end. And I think both yourself and Ed talked about those kind of 2 weeks to go type of opportunities to sort of build on the momentum. Session.
I'll come back on that point around use of Snapchat. We found on smoking cessation campaigns that actually you need to simplify things much. So just clicking through from Snapchat to a long form consultation did not work well at all. And putting small questions into Snapchat, engaging, getting one question answered, and then having follow-up ones, that seems to be the way to go. And I think there is no substitute for in person. It's the quality and the things you get from that you probably weren't even thinking of. Fabulous. But then scaling it with digital is the way to go. You always need South Yorkshire's biggest ear to be in the room and to help shape the consultation as it goes. But it's very much one of those things of a bit like jumping off a cliff and building a plane on the way down. You can change this as it runs. Based on what you're hearing, which is really exciting and creative and fascinating in quite a limited time frame.
Brilliant. Thank you, JP. And yes, definitely think we've all had those moments where we've spent a lot of time and effort on an individual resident, but also actually some of those things really do provide some golden moments either within the campaign team or within a wider audience. Ed, just coming to you to see if you had any final comments or learning before we close this session today.
Yeah, I think probably whether it's with community groups, whether it's with colleges, whether it's with, for us constituent councils, I think, that power of collaboration when you're scoping this sort of activity is really important. I think for us, it's been really helpful in terms of building relationships, not only with constituent councils, actually not only with organisations on patch. We've done some work off the back of it with the Bus Centre of Excellence, working with other upper tier authorities and MCAs that might be looking to go down this path. So I think, actually the more, time, everyone's very busy, but the more time we can invest in some of that collaboration and bringing people together, and particularly as sort of, mayoral combined authorities where we can convene other authorities for discussions like this, I think is just something that, we should absolutely find the time to do, because it certainly paid dividends in terms of our consultation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed. And yeah, thank you to all of our speakers today, Danielle and JP. Really fascinating stuff. Definitely things that I've learnt from today. And yeah, as I said at the start, we'll be sharing the slides around to everyone and also the recording of the session. So thanks once again. Enjoy the sun and yeah, have a good day.